Hi guys, so this lesson is actually a continuation of the previous lesson on reasons for birth and death rates going up or going down, and that lesson was about population growth. One of the key ways that you may be asked to discuss these factors of high and low birth rates and high and low death rates, it focuses on population pyramids. And through this lesson, I'm also going to deal with a special kind of graph called the demographic transition model. So this is an important series of lessons, and ones that you'll probably want to watch this video a few times to really get to grips with it all, and definitely make sure that you've got all of these notes. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, what is a population pyramid? It's a graph. The graph on its left-hand side has a excuse me 1 second here, guys. I'm just going to actually get a wee laser pointer. There we go. So the graph has on the left-hand side the males. The graph won't be in color in your exam, but it normally will tell you which side is male, and females are on the right-hand side. Along the bottom are values. These values may not be in percentages, they may be in real numbers, but nonetheless they show you the amount of the population in each of the bars on the graph. And up the side you can see ages. These are age brackets going from 0 all the way up to maximum life expectancy. And you can therefore tell what percentage, in this case Nigeria, of the population is 0 to 4 years old and female. Okay, so the first thing that you'll be asked to do is to describe one of these graphs. So let's make sure that we know all the basic things that you can say to describe these graphs. First of all, you can see that this arrow has appeared pointing towards the bottom of the graph. The bottom of the graph in this case is very wide compared to the rest of it, and that shows that there is a high birth rate. There is a large number of babies being born and introduced into the bottom of the graph each year. So we would describe this as a high birth rate. It has a wide, flat base to the pyramid. There is also, sadly, a high death rate in this country. Now you can see in the writing on the left, that's because the sides fade away quickly. Let me explain this a little bit. Let's imagine that the people living in Nigeria were in fact immortal and they never died. Well, in that case, each bar of the pyramid would never get any shorter as the people aged, and the graph would just go straight up into the air forever. And of course it wouldn't stop at 100, would it? But it would just go straight up. Of course, people are not immortal. People do die. And people, sadly, die at all sorts of stages during their lives. And in Nigeria, it is clear that after people are 4 years old, 1% of males can be expected to have died. I can work that out because 8.5% of males are 0 to 4, 7.5 are 5 to 9 years old. Therefore, there's a whole 1% less males in Nigeria. Those males have either moved out of Nigeria, and a small number may have done, but the only other explanation is that shortfall is because they died. There is a third theoretical explanation, which is that in the year those 5 to 9 year olds were born, there was just a strangely lower birth rate, and that would account for the smaller number. But that's less a likely reason for you to focus on. So you can see that people are quite rapidly dying away as they get older. So we call it a high death rate. People die quite quickly in this country, and you can see the graph narrows very extremely towards the top. Consider in your own lives, who do you know that's over the age of 55? You probably know lots of people, if you think about it, who are over the age of 55. Teachers, relatives, friends of your relatives. But in Nigeria, only 1.9, 2.5, 2.9, 3.1, 3.2% of the population, only 3.2 out of every 100 people is over the age of 55 and male. So it's clear that a lot of people have died before they get to the age of 55. There is therefore a high death rate. If you're not very comfortable with graphs and you're not very confident, just think the steeper the graph fades away with this curve shape, the higher the death rate is. A short pyramid, i.e. a pyramid that doesn't extend very high, you can see all these zeros up here, that tells you that there's a low life expectancy. There are some other more subtle things that you can identify on pyramids. Notice, for example, that there are more male babies, or infants 0 to 4 years old, than there are female infants. This is sadly the case in many, many countries around the world, not just developing countries, but also developed countries. And there are a number of different factors that feed into this. One factor that's worth considering, just to briefly understand this, is that male babies can often be favored with more food or better access to education and healthcare. And that can impact upon their life expectancies. That's one factor that can play into that, but it is a complex picture. So you can spot subtle things when you're describing these graphs. For example, more women survive into the age 65 to 69 than men. And again, there's lots of reasons why that might be. One reason, for you to easily understand it, is that men tend to take more risk-taking behavior. For example, men tend to have higher rates of smoking, men tend to drink more, men tend to take less care of themselves throughout their lifespans. Now, these may sound like very sweeping general statements, but country after country around the world, the population pyramids don't lie. You tend to find less males in the elderly age groups, and sadly, more infant males surviving in the younger age groups. So these basic descriptions are ones you can always use to describe the graphs. Okay, this graph is for Nigeria, which is a developing country, but what if you're asked to describe a graph in a developed country? Here, for example, is Japan. Japan's a highly developed country, and you can see that its pyramid is significantly different. Before I even put the notes up, you can see immediately it has a much lower birth rate. You can see that because the bottom of the graph is very narrow. Notice again that males do outweigh females in this highly developed society. Up in the elderly bracket, notice that females outweigh males in this very, very developed country with exceptional healthcare. And that extends right up into very old age groups. This graph does not fade away very quickly. In fact, it only really starts to get narrower. Think about where the graph starts to get narrower. Well, it's not getting narrow here, 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 here. I suppose it does start to get narrow there, but it gets wider again. Oh, here it goes. It's getting narrower here. So really, the death rate can really only be said to have a significant impact at the age of 75 in Japan. Compare that to the graph you've just seen in Nigeria, where the death rate had an obvious impact from the age of 4. So what are the basic descriptions? There is a low birth rate with a narrow bottom of the graph. There is a lower death rate as the sides of the graph don't fade away very quickly. There's a high life expectancy. It's a very tall pyramid. Females are outweighed by males in the early years, and females outweigh the males in the older years. Now, if you were asked to describe the graphs, then you would get marks for each of these statements. Another question to practice and to be very, very aware of is that you might be asked to compare graphs, in which case you should say there is a low birth rate in Japan, whereas in Nigeria there is a higher birth rate. And using that comparative language of the word whereas is very important there. Okay, so That's all very well and done, but it's nice to see how population pyramids actually work. Now, these images will just repeat on the screen, so you can kind of watch whichever one you want to for a few times. But over time, the shape of a population pyramid changes. And you can see that, for example, if we focus on Brazil, Brazil's population pyramid is going to track from the year 2000 to 2100. Now, we're only in 2020 right now, 2021, but we can predict what a population is going to do by looking at the recent patterns in how their population is changing. And you'll see just by watching this graph repeat that in the year 2000, Brazil has quite a wide birth rate. It's got a wide base to the graph, so they're having lots of babies. However, changes to their society in family planning, sex education, females going into careers, etc., are lowering that birth rate. So the bottom of the graph gets narrower. Also, improvements in healthcare, diet, nutrition, and quality of people's lifestyles means that the sides of the graph aren't getting so narrow so dramatically. The death rate is getting lower. People are surviving longer and longer into their lifetime. Finally, have a look at Brazil's total population. You'd think that by reducing the number of babies that we have, you would reduce the population. And you can see that partially that is true. At first, though, the population will go up quite rapidly. And only once you've reached the very, very final stages of the graph, when the birth rate is low and the death rate is also very low, will the population start to come down again. Okay, having taken all of that into account, it's useful for you just to watch these graphs change. Notice Germany's graph is very distinct as well. They are already a very developed society. Their birth rate starts off low. The funny ripples that you see towards the top of their graph, those are old baby booms, old years of very high birth rate, moving through the graph. That generation of a large baby generation getting older. Okay. If we look at a couple of more examples, here we have 3 developing countries. Burkina Faso is a very developing country, and you can see its birth rate reflects that. But you can also see that Burkina Faso wants to develop and is putting in place strategies to reduce birth rates, and over time we can expect those birth rates to fall. This sounds like good news. We want populations to be under control, but of course Burkina Faso will have problems in the future. They are going to have to provide housing and healthcare to an increasingly elderly population, and that's a challenge they'll face. Look at Qatar's pyramid. It looks really bizarre. They have seemingly a huge male proportion of the population. Not only that, but males seem to be surviving into their elderly years in significant proportion. One of the reasons for this is a very significant proportion of the population being male immigrant population, people coming across to work. Other reasons speak to the level of investment made into the lives of females, into their education, healthcare, and dietary needs throughout their lives. Other factors may also be considered when we think of their census records, where females can be underrepresented on their census. So population pyramids can show you a lot about a country. They're really fascinating things once you start to understand what it is that you're looking at. The main thing I want you to take from these pictures I've shown you is that population pyramids are not fixed. They are, in fact, the ones you see in the exam are a snapshot of a graph that is constantly moving and changing. Here finally we look at the UK, Kenya and the United States. And I'll just let those ones play for a few loops so you can watch them and make your own conclusions. Okay, so where does that leave us? That takes us neatly on to looking at the demographic transition model. The demographic transition model is a graph that shows how population changes across 4 or 5 stages. In stage 1, in fact what I'll do is I'm going to show you the whole graph first of all. This is the whole graph. It's divided into 1, 2, 3, 4 and sometimes 5 stages. In each stage we can talk about what the birth rate is doing and the death rate and how that is impacting upon the total population of a country that is in stage 1. It's easier though if we just blank off some parts of the graph and deal with these in isolation. So, in stage 1 countries, your population pyramid would look like this. You can see that it is a very developing country with a wide, high birth rate and a high death rate as well. Because the death rate is high, see, the death rate line up here is very high up the graph. And because the birth rate is high, see, the birth rate is very high up the graph, up the side of the graph here. They cancel each other out. So what that means is even though lots and lots and lots of babies are being born, lots and lots and lots of people are also dying. So the total population doesn't really go anywhere. The total population remains very low and it doesn't grow. So they kind of cancel each other out. In stage 2, however, look at the graph at the bottom. We've still got a very high birth rate. The bottom of the graph is still very, very wide. But look at what happened to the sides of the graph. Compare this graph to this graph. The sides have kind of bulged out. They're not fading away so narrowly, so rapidly. What does that mean for the death rate? Well, it means that the death rate has got lower. And you can see that it says that here. The death rate falls rapidly, but the birth rate stays high. Let's look at the graph. Here's the birth rate, and yep, it stays high. And here's the death rate, falling very, very rapidly. Now, if we have lots and lots and lots of babies, but fewer and fewer and fewer people are dying, what's going to happen to the total number of people in the country? Well, you can see that for yourself by looking at the total population line. It goes up and up and up. And countries that are in stage 2 tend to have exploding populations. They are populations that are growing very, very rapidly. Now, what reasons would there be for this? Well, all of the reasons that we discussed in the death rates section of the birth and death rates video would apply. So this country would be putting in place better healthcare, better food, better nutrition, better sanitation, and those things are working together to drive down death rates. What are they not doing though? They're not putting in place family planning. They're not putting in place sex education and freely available contraception. Women are not gaining access to careers and further education in their lives, and therefore the birth rate remains high. You could be asked to describe and explain any of the stages in the demographic transition model. To do this, you need to be able to describe each stage. That's what I've been doing so far. The birth rate is high, the death rate is high, the total population is low and stable. Here the birth rate is high, but the death rate is falling, so the total population grows rapidly. You might also have to give reasons for these things, and to do that, you need to focus on the video lesson I've given on why birth and death rates are high or low. Let's look at stage 3. In stage 3, you can see the death rate, though it's still falling, it evens off. It can't fall much further. So we've really got a society here that's managed to reduce its death rates a lot. If you look at the graph at the bottom, you can see that this graph has now even started to develop completely straight sides. This shows that no or very few people are dying until later in their lives. Remember, the more the graph bulges out the way at the sides, the lower the death rate is. So this country must have advanced healthcare. They must have really thought through their sanitation systems. They must have put in place mechanisms to deliver vaccination programs to stop disease. People must be better educated about how to keep themselves healthy and spot symptoms of disease as well. The birth rate, though, interestingly, is also falling. So this graph has got a slightly narrower base. And that's because in stage 3, a country has got education. Women or girls and boys get to go to school, perhaps. And that is increasing people's awareness of sex education and family planning. Perhaps we're in the early stages of women starting to have careers and therefore delaying having children altogether. Perhaps the economy isn't so reliant upon children as a workforce. Perhaps with this longer life expectancy and lower death rates, we don't need so many children to look after the elderly. If you've watched the birth and death rates lesson, a lot of these reasons should be very familiar to you. And let me repeat myself. In this question, you are going to be asked to do one or two things. The first is to describe what is happening in any of the stages of the demographic transition model. What is the birth rate doing? What is the death rate doing? What is the overall population doing? For each description, you'll get a mark. Then you might also be asked to explain why these things are happening. To do that, you should focus on the birth rate and the death rate and the reasons why birth rates might be increasing or falling and why the death rate might be falling or why the death rate might be high. Stage 4. A stage 4 country like our own, and there I mean Scotland, we're at the latter stage of stage 4, progressing towards stage 5. Here we have our birth rate is not just, it's still falling, but we're really reaching this end of the line of the birth rate now, where our birth rate is getting so low that it's getting to its lowest possible point. Our death rate is consistently low and has remained low for a long time. Now, if you've not got very many deaths and you've not really got very many births, well, then the population isn't really going to go up or down. It's going to remain stable because those two things cancel each other out. It's a little bit like at this end of the graph. However, the difference being is that through Scotland going through stage 1, 2, and 3 already, our total population has already reached a large number. So the total population is high, but it's not growing very rapidly anymore. The reasons for this are all to do with women having education, access to careers, delaying childbirth, people getting married later and therefore being less fertile and therefore having less children, and of course children being very expensive and therefore people deciding to have fewer of them. There's also things like cultural change to remember, where there's less pressure on young people to have children, as was perhaps not the case in a stage 3 society. Notice the graph has a lower birth rate again, has really tall steep sides now, the death rate has really fallen, and the graph is in fact taller because people are living longer. And in stage 5, well, in stage 5, there are some countries that claim to be in stage 5 these days. And in stage 5, you can expect the death rate to remain very low because healthcare has reached a standard, a very, very high standard. People have very healthy lives. People know how to keep themselves healthy and know how to spot the symptoms of disease early because of good education. And you might expect the birth rate to slightly pick up again. This is very much theoretical. And the reasons for that are that people might, the economic burden might not be quite so strong for people living in stage 5 countries. Your revision should focus on stages 1 to 4. Learn how to describe the birth and the death rate and the total population in stage 1 to 4. And then revise how to say the appropriate thing to explain the birth and the death rate in stage 1 to 4. The birth rate is either very high, or very low, or falling. The death rate is either very high, very low, or falling. And it's up to you to decide which factors would explain that the best. So back to population pyramids. One of the things you'll be asked to do with these is to describe and explain them. Now, I've already shown you how to describe them, and in a previous lesson we've already dealt with the explanations, so this should really feel quite familiar to you. You know that you can say that there's a high birth rate here and there is a high death rate because the graph fades off quite rapidly. And there's a high death rate because there's a lack of sanitation. But make sure that you point out that that lack of sanitation, that means lack of drains and clean drinking water. What's the impact of that? Well, it spreads disease. There's your mark. There's a lack of vaccines. Don't stop there. Don't just say that. What's the impact of that? It leads to a high infant mortality rate, a high number of children dying. There's a lack of health care and a lack of elderly care too. There's a high birth rate. There's our description. And this is due to a lack of access to contraception. This might also be because children can provide work for a family. They can be actually part of the workforce that you wouldn't have to pay. Children can care for elderly people, where in Bolivia there may not be such good care, as you've already said. There's a lack of elderly care. Those children can care for the elderly. There might be a lack of family planning or understanding about sex education. And there might be already quite a high infant mortality rate. Children might die quite easily in Bolivia, and therefore people are making the decision to have more children to ensure that some survive. Essentially, what you're looking at on the screen is in fact a model answer. I've described the graph by pointing out it has a high death rate and by pointing out it has a high birth rate. And I've provided 4 good reasons why the death rate is high and 5 good reasons why the birth rate is high. And through that, I would most assuredly score all of the marks for the question, if that was all I was asked to do. Here, for a MEDC pyramid, in this case the Netherlands, my description is that there is a low death rate. Look at the sides of the graph, they bulge out the way. It only really starts to get narrow after people reach about 70 to 74 years old. This is because proper sanitation limits the spread of disease. Vaccines keep infant mortality down. Good healthcare stops illness, and strong elderly care lengthens lifespans. Notice that what I've done is I've taken the same explanations from my previous graph and I've just reused them. So that's a way to reduce the amount of revision you need to do. A low birth rate is my description, and that's because of freely available contraception. Children are an economic burden. Many women delaying childbirth in favour of a career, and many couples only plan to have 1 or 2 children. Maybe cultural change. And if those reasons that you're seeing on the screen aren't familiar to you, that's because you haven't paid attention to the birth and death rates video that's before this one on the website. So make sure you watch them all. Make sure you watch all the videos and take notes from them all. Sometimes you'll see that there are odd bulges in the side of a graph. How is it that there's this weird massive number of kind of 45 to 55-year-old males in the Netherlands, for example? This may be due to historical events. Maybe the birth rate in the Netherlands was very high when these people were born, and that explains why this bit's wider. That could be because their economy was doing particularly well back then. Also, it could be that this group of individuals were a particular wave of immigration into the country. And so that explains why the population is slightly larger there. That's quite advanced if you want to do that. Now, it's important that you should be aware that you might be asked to explain the differences. And you can see that both graphs are lined up next to each other, and that you've been asked to explain the differences in population structures of Bolivia and the Netherlands. You need to refer to both birth rates and death rates in your answer. Because it's a differences question, you need to refer to both Bolivia and the Netherlands in your answer. So I'm only going to briefly demonstrate this because I've really covered all the fundamental basics. But you could say Bolivia has a high birth rate, whereas the Netherlands has a lower birth rate. There is a difference. The reason for this is that Bolivia, they lack access to contraception. Children may be used as workers in the family and may be required to care for the elderly, whereas in the Netherlands there's less cultural pressure to have children. Children are an economic burden to families, so they can't afford them, and women have careers, so delay having children. Now right there I've provided 6 separate reasons for the comparison in birth rates. And I could do the same for the death rates. So it's not a particularly difficult question. And in fact, by getting you to look at 2 graphs and compare them, I think they make your life easier because they give you more to talk about. Just make sure that when you've got a question that it says explain the differences, you are using that word whereas to spot the difference before you explain it. Okay, the next lesson is going to be on development indicators. So you can watch that in your own time. I hope that helped, guys.